Welcome to the weekly philosophy chat on Hello Philo. Doesn't it feel like our world is making our differences a lot more obvious than our similarities? Well, in fact, we are all very different, but when do those differences translate to strength, and when do they translate to phobias or even hatred? Today we'll be discussing possible limitations in human tolerance, and when the very qualities that make us diverse can sometimes bring upon destructive narratives. We're going to try to keep our conversation philosophical in nature and maintain some distance between the political and the religious if we can. If you believe in critical thinking and the power of philosophy, please like this video and subscribe for more. Let's jump right in. I'm Claire Foster, and I'm joined today by Dotan Rousseau.
Hello, Claire. Very good to be here, as always.
Thanks for coming. So let's get right into it. Dotan, I'd be very curious to know, when do our differences become threatening?
Well, I think maybe what we should start with is acknowledging a basic fact about human processing or thinking process. And that is that we think in categories. We make generalizations. This is just how we approach the world. There are evolutionary reasons for this. And when we observe a certain phenomena on a small scale, we make conclusions from it, a general conclusion. This is just a fact. So we have this tendency to identify individuals as part of something which is more general, and adjust those, you may name it stereotypes or general conclusions to those individuals. So this is just, as I mentioned, a fact about us. The second thing that we should acknowledge is that different groups do have or contain differences. This is true. We're not all the same, right? Different countries, different people, different cultures have different characteristics. And this, of course, impacts the individuals themselves as well, because the self identity is very much a product of the group that we're part of. So, as a starting point, we must put this first on the table. Now, things becomes much more complicated when this identification of a group, which can sometimes be factually based, also translate to moral judgment slash sometimes hatred, group hatred, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, whatever that would be.
Mhm. Yes, and can you identify how that comes to be? How do we make that transition, knowingly or unknowingly, from the acknowledgement, or in some cases, the denial of differences between us, to a moral judgment?
Well, there could be a variety of reasons for this. First of all, it's much easier for us to seek for the simplest explanation than to actually dig into the complexity of those differences. Let's take, for example, a fact about Jewish people, right? Jewish people are very successful as a factual matter in terms of, for example, academics and science and so on. Well, the Jewish population is about 15 million people all over out of 8 billion people, which is 0.2% of the population. As one example, they contain 20% of the Nobel Prize winners, which is a huge, disproportional amount. Now, this is a fact that no one can argue about, but this is left for interpretations, and different people can interpret this differently. So one interpretation can be on a very superficial level, can be, well, the Jews are controlling the major central powers, and they have this influence, and therefore they eventually translate it to all sorts of benefits and rewards and so on. Another explanation, which can be much more complicated, is identifying the history of the Jewish people. For example, that they were not allowed to work in certain jobs through centuries, and therefore they had to invest more in education, and therefore they became more oriented towards education, and eventually this translates to, but these two different explanations require completely different amount of effort and digging into the topic. And people very often we just make a preference to choose the easy answer or the easy. Now that is one reason. A second reason sometimes may be connected to, again, this temptation that we have to make wide generalizations from the particular, right? If a certain group, for example, or certain individuals who are part from a certain group committing a crime or committing a terror attack, then based on this human tendency, we generalize this to the whole group. It's an easy, natural, instinctive process. Now, when emotions get involved, then the moral judgments become even much more intense. So there's a variety of reasons why this actually happens. But what makes it much more complicated is that, as I mentioned before, there are factual differences. Some of them are positive, some of them are negatives. When they are positive, it's not a big issue, right? If you identify a certain group or a certain individual as one who is more likely to have a positive characteristics, let's say he's more likely to be successful in athletics because is a part of a certain group which is known to be more stronger, right? In athletics, that is usually not a problem. But when the identification is negative, then this becomes much more complicated.
I think what you've said about the moral judgment that one might make as a result of observing these differences, I think that's of interest, and it's certainly relatable to anti-Semitism today and many other issues. Can you talk more about sort of the moral trying to create moral equivalence, trying to establish one's own sense of morality in thinking about others instead of just truly looking at the other group for the qualities or characteristics they may or may not have, but sort of as it refers to oneself and their own sense of morality.
Well, we can observe it from different angles, but let's consider this example. Certain societies are more corrupted than others. This is not because by their DNA the people are born to be more corrupted, obviously not, but because of political reasons, historical reasons, political climate, whatever that would be, the culture, the society, the state is more corrupted. This is a fact. No one can argue this. Now, another fact is that as individuals, we are very much the product of the society, the cultures, the norms that we're part of. So this may result with identifying a certain individual, let's say a certain immigrant, to be more likely to have tendencies or to compromise, let's say, topics related to corruption. Now, the question here would be, to what degree is it factual, and to what degree is it is a moral fail or a moral judgment which is false, which is wrong? Now, there's a tension here between the need, first of all, the need to be honest, and that is something and truthful, and that is something that philosophy and critical thinking is all about, right? Acknowledging reality as is, whether you like it or not, whether it's comfortable or discomfortable, uh, um, and um, and also being able, of course, to separate between the individuals and the category that they're part of. So this becomes very, very complicated in real life. And there are all sorts of involved, right? Because it's not just about truth. It's also about the implications of this truth, right? Because once you identify, let's say, something which is factual, let's assume so, then this may also result with all sorts of social implications if the society actually treats individuals in accordance to this. So, how do you actually combine the two, and what should you prioritize in this context? Maybe one could argue that truth and honesty, while important and crucial, they're not absolute, and sometimes we should compromise this for other social needs and for other social moral judgment and moral reasons and so on. So these things are becoming very complicated. I'm not sure if this answered exactly what you were referring to, but it aligns with this or attempt to provide some light into this.
Yeah. So, would you say do you think that we, as humanity, we come from different countries? So, in general, do you think we have a problem with truth telling right now? Do you think that that's something that we need to be working on in our communities, in our countries? There is so much. There's stereotypes. There's narratives. There's media, and I agree that sometimes facts are subjective. That's true. People see things from different lenses. But in general, do you think that we as humans have a problem with truth telling? Are we afraid to tell the truth now?
Well, I think truth sometimes can be painful, right? And very often the problem is not necessarily with recognizing the truth, as I mentioned, the group differences, and therefore maybe the impact that this may have on individuals, but rather the kind of translation interpretations that we give into it. And sometimes, as I mentioned, superficial involved, the need to find easy answers, emotions are involved. And also, we have very many people have this tendency to identify, to distinguish themselves from other groups because of all sorts of reasons. Many of them are not necessarily based on moral, good, positive motives. And the climate that we're living now is even much more radical in this sense because we live in an era where identifying what facts are becoming very, very complicated, and they mixed with interpretation in a very strong way. So interpretations become facts. And when this happens, you end up with a lot of racism and hatred and so on, because a certain difference is interpreted and explained in ways which are not coherent necessarily with the facts. They are originated by other sources and other motivations, but eventually that end up as a factual identification of a certain group or of a certain individual. And I think that there are many groups today who feels this. Actually, maybe all groups, right? If you're a white American or white what we call, some people would consider you as privileged, and they would attach all sorts of stereotypes to you as being white, right? White supremacy and so on. If you're black, of course, there are implications to this. If you're a Muslim, if you're a Jewish, so if you're an immigrant, right? So no matter what group you're related to, you are forced to be drawn into this mix and sometimes even chaotic arena of interpretations and explanations that attempt to provide identification of who you are, which very, very often can be misleading as well.
Yeah. I have an interesting example that I would love to get your thoughts on that sort of goes away from the ethnic and the religious, but something a bit more modern, which is obesity. So in the world that we live in right now, it is hard to be an obese person, and I think obese people would agree with that. And from everything that I've read and observed myself. But what's interesting is that in the past year or so, there's been a cure, if you will, introduced to obesity, which are these GLP-1s that many have taken and many have seen tremendous differences as a result. So this is sort of this interesting case study of self-identifying as something that perhaps you have experienced your entire life, much in the way of a religion, or of course it's very different, but something that's been attached to you for a very long time. And all of a sudden, there is something that can change your identity. And the question is, do you want to change your identity? Should you change yourself to conform to the rest of the world to make your life easier, to arguably make the world's existence easier in terms of overall healthcare concerns? And what are the ethical implications of fixing people in this way? But I wanted to introduce that as an example to talk about because it's something that it could be part of an individual, but that is something that is there are stereotypes and there are negative associations with obesity, and it's now something that it can be addressed. And so, what do we do with that, and how do we think about that in terms of whether our differences are a strength, or is this another example of differences being a weakness?
Well, one of the problems of identifying an individual based on this generalization of the group that he's coming from is that it creates motivation sometimes or conflict between the self-identity and the group that you're part of. Because if you're being criticized, if you're paying social prices, you are more motivated to distinct yourself from this group. And this applies to the example that you were giving, and it can apply to many other examples, right? There are, for example, Jews around the world today who tend to distinguish themselves from Judaism or part of Judaism, or at least the parts which are related to Israel or considered to be related to Israel, because this comes with a lot of criticism and social consequences. And of course, this can apply to many other groups as well. So what this creates is it creates a self-conflict with your own identity, which becomes much more problematic. So it's not just about a general, a categorical criticism or judgment. It's becoming very, very personal, and it's also affecting your personality in a very tremendous way because you're becoming conflicted with your own identity. And once this happens, some people would tend to become different than what they are, to resist their origin, their connection, their context. And very often, this would lead to all sorts of psychological and philosophical dissonance, which in their turn would have a negative impact on the quality of the of life of the individual. So I think that is definitely one of the implications of this reality where people are being identified as part of the group, and the identification of the group is being put on them, sometimes in a very negative context and a very negative way. And let me ask you in this regard, um, acknowledging this, what is the right approach from critical thinking and from philosophical perspective? If we had the ability to, create a society or norms, what should be prioritized? Honesty, directness, bluntness sometimes, acknowledging reality as is when it is reality, of course. So that is a difficult question by itself. What is reality? What is our fact and what are not? Or actually compromising this for social reasons, for peace, for more acceptable society and so on.
I think personally that a successful society should be diverse. It should be transparently diverse. I think that our differences do ultimately make us stronger. Where we come from, the languages, our socioeconomic backgrounds, these things are good for schools. They are good for the job, the workplace. They are good for neighborhoods. They are good for politics. They're good for economics. The changes, and particularly in the United States, to some extent Canada and others around the world as well, we pride ourselves in bringing many different types of people, well, historically anyway, to the country to create that diversity. And I do think ultimately that's a strength. I think where we sometimes find it to be problematic is when that diversity, those differences, and then the transparency associated with those differences starts to threaten the existing structures of power. And then all of a sudden, the differences aren't so beautiful anymore. The differences become scary, right? And we see that to some extent with our in our political climate, and with in many other areas of our life as well. So I think that's sort of the interesting piece to keep in mind is that at what point do our changes, and this goes back to what we were originally talking about, become threatening, not just to us as individuals, but to a country, to a community. And I think it's when those differences start to disrupt the existing structure of power and the existing climate in which the society has historically been successfully operating.
So, in such circumstances, we are forced to prioritize what should prevail: openness and uh, you know acceptance and so on, or we should prioritize being honest and following dishonesty. And let's take a concrete example.
Mm.
Immigration is a huge topic now in Western countries. And there are many people who argue that immigration should not be open to all, but rather it should be selective. Why selective? Because some cultures, some societies are more likely to integrate with the welcoming country and to be beneficial to the welcoming country, and some are not. And this is just a fact that this debate exists, right? And Trump, for example, just very recently decided that I think it was 30 countries, people from 30 countries, will not be allowed into the United States. So this is a very practical issue. Now, how should we address this? Should we accept, and I put this as a question and not, of course, as a statement, should we accept that there are differences? Those differences are real. and they should be taken into consideration in such decisions, although they are impacting the individuals who are not necessarily, obviously, share the same identification of the group, right? Obviously not. Yet they will be the one to be influenced. If you deny a person to immigrant from a certain place, a certain country, because you identify the category that he's coming from as problematic, let's say, right? Then you're harming him, maybe unjustifiably, because maybe he as an individual doesn't carry those characteristics. On the other hand, right, if you make major decisions and it needs to be based on statistics and so on, one would argue that this is a rational, coherent, honest, truthful decision which is based and correlates with facts. How should we address this?
I mean, if there was one simple blanket answer for how we should receive immigrants into the country, I think I would also be on that list for Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize today. But clearly, I'm not. But of course, is it efficient for the government to individually interview each immigrant applicant and determine their motivations and interests in the country to which they're immigrating? No, of course not. But is it practical? Is it ethical for the leader of a country to establish blanket rules across that impact every person who is trying to make a new life in our country? I would argue that's probably not ethical. And so perhaps the solution is somewhere in between, keeping in mind that there's a need for efficiency and how many people can actually manage this process while keeping it safe and affordable and equitable for the citizens who either were born here or came here with, in legal means. So, there is no blanket answer to that. I think that our presidents, the current one and the one before it, have made very different decisions in terms of how they have approached the immigration issue, and I think it's led to very real consequences, at least in the United States. And you can see that there's backlash on both sides when you accept differences, and no matter what they are, no matter what your background is, there's incredible backlash because you can see now with the current administration that they it can point to specific examples where people have been hurt. People's jobs have been taken by folks who've tried to come here. Of course, there's always going to be examples of these things. So I think what is essential is the critical thinking piece and looking past the individual examples that you can point to with immigration, you can point to it with anti-Semitism, you can point to it with every subject under the sun and say, oh, well, there is one Jewish person I know who absolutely hates the administration and hates what's happening in Gaza. And so, therefore, either all Jews must think this, or this is the correct way of thinking it because some token Jew has felt this way. And again, you can apply that logic to absolutely every issue. And I think that's really where we have the biggest problem in general in our media is we point to these specific examples that must create some sort of moral equivalence to a larger story. And it's simply incorrect. You simply can't do that, and that's where the critical thinking comes in, to just take a step back, look at the context, look at the history, and admit that one person is not going to have the single solution to any of these larger concerns. We have to keep talking about it, and we have to keep listening, not just to the people that we think we agree with, but to a wide variety of sources.
Very interesting. But to challenge you, we can break this down to subtopics, philosophically and critically speaking. First stage would be to ask, again on a philosophical level, is it legitimate? Is it coherent? Is it factually based to argue that the individual is product of the society, the context that he's coming from? Of course, there are exceptionals, right? But as a generalization, right, the individual carries, likely to carry fundamental characteristics of the group that he's coming from, statistically generally. Is this true? On a logical level, on a critical thinking level,
If we are products of the countries that we come from,
in the society that we come from, the society.
versus,
So let's say we grew up in I give this example, of a corrupted country. If we grew up in a corrupted country where it's very legitimate that if a policeman stops you, the first thing that you would do is to offer him money, and everywhere you go, this is how you survive. does it is it coherent? Is it acceptable as a factual truth to argue that a person who was born to such a society, and let's say at the age of 30, is very likely to hold similar characteristics because of the context that he grew up in, and therefore he's more likely to have this tolerance towards corruption.
I don't know that one sense of ethics and morality is necessarily built in based on your behaviors within your country, within your upbringing. I understand the example that you're giving, and I think that individuals understand how to survive in a certain context. I don't think that means that they're incapable of understanding the moral playground, the moral life that one is expected to lead if they were to exist in another context. In other words, if that person was to immigrate to a country which didn't allow for bribery or whatever the example is, that person is incapable of understanding that or incapable of following the rules. I I think particularly with with information that we have access to and how culture is so widely spread across countries through media and modern resources, I don't think there would be any reason to think that someone wouldn't be able to understand the rules of another context. And so I don't think that would be a blanket reason for prohibiting entry into our country. I do not. What do you think? Do you disagree?
No, I think this is at its core, it's a philosophical question. What makes us who we are? To what degree we are isolated, we are free from the context that we are part of? And there's no fixed question answer to this. And I think people, whether they use those philosophical terms or analysis or not, they categorize this differently. And based on the intuitive characterization of this, they may end up with certain conclusions regarding practical questions such as immigration.
Mm.
I definitely agree with you. There's no question that people can separate themselves from their upbringing and the kind of this cultural the norms that they were educated and raised on. But this is a fundamental question, and also even if we pass this question again, another fundamental question is that what should be prioritized? Should we, as philosophers, as critical thinkers, would you agree that truth, assuming in certain areas truth is pricey, right? It comes with heavy cost, social cost, and others. Should we sometimes compromise truth? For example, by using political correctness as a norm, which basically limits the range of a conversation. What is acceptable to talk about? What is not? What kind of questions are legitimate? What are not? Right? What kind of answers? Political correctness is very much about this. And while it has also a lot of positive there's a lot of positive things about it. It also has negative things because it suppresses sometimes honesty and truthfulness. So where do you stand on this big question? Where on the hierarchy commitment to truth should be?
Well, truth in terms of political correctness and speaking to individuals.
Also,
Yeah. Um,
because limits of tolerance is very much connected to this.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think we've even talked about it in terms of communication styles, and this really goes in many different directions. I tend to lean towards being a little bit. I would classify myself as polite, and I do try to be cognizant of where people are coming from, and I am respectful of the ways people have asked me to communicate with them in more modern terms. Generally, though, in my own mind, I do tend to lean a little bit more towards sort of just straight truth telling, and but I that is with the caveat that I am respectful for how others want to be communicated to, and so for example, I know several individuals who prefer alternative pronouns. This is another subject we could get into another time. I respect those pronouns. If that is what they would like to be called, then that is what I will call them. And so in that sense, that might be considered politically correct, and perhaps not in line with everyone's political view. It's not a political issue, it's more of a
On
human
a
issue.
philosophical level, what people would say to you, and I completely agree with you, I would do the same, and I do the same with
Yeah.
people who are identify themselves differently. But people would say, on the other side, people do. I'm not willing to compromise my own truth. And my own truth is that, objectively speaking, truth, let's say, is a male or a female, whatever
Yeah.
that would be, right? This example illustrates the same thing
Yeah.
that the same conflict that we're discussing. Should truth be put on the top of the list? You are professionalizing in philosophy for children, and this is always a way for us. I think a good way, a method to reflect on ourselves and ask ourselves when we actually try to to figure out what is the moral direction. How would we educate our children?
Yeah. So, I mean,
So, if you were
truth.
to educate your children regarding truth, would you tell to them truth should be on top, or you would say truth is just one out of few things that you should aim for, and you should balance between the different things.
Well, to use that example, I I wouldn't classify one's truth as more correct over another. Now, I do think in general it's dangerous to say that there is no truth from a philosophical standpoint, because then you can argue that that one person says one thing and another person says the complete
Everything
opposite,
goes.
and everything goes and everything is fine. And obviously that's not acceptable ethically, morally, or otherwise. But in terms of the pronoun example, I don't accept that just because one person, either due to ignorance or whatever other feelings, beliefs, background they may have, because they don't recognize that someone else feels a certain way about their own body and their own heart and their own mind, that that isn't true. How could they possibly know how this other person feels? I don't know how a person who carries pronouns with they them feels. I don't, but I respect that that feels accurate and authentic to them, and I honor that as from human to human. That might not be my personal truth, because that's not how I feel inside, but I am a human just like you, and we have the same blood and we have the same skin and we have all the things that make us human. And I respect how you feel. And so if that is your truth, I'm honoring that.
But one would
And
argue that a gender, again, I bring this is not my opinion, but
yeah, 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 yeah.
one would argue that being male or female is an objective thing. That is why you can take a blood test and be identified either way, right? It's not about a feeling, it's not about how you see yourself. It's just a fact. So if it is a fact, right, there's a certain chromosome, right, which identify you as a woman or a male. This is a biological thing. So the argument would be that there's a conflict here between truth and honesty and being loyal to truth, right, as a virtue, as a matter of moral stand, versus compromising this for other um, reasons, or other moral uh, virtues and at the hierarchy.
Yeah, well, one's chromosomal makeup is different than your gender. And this is something that I believe, and it's become a political issue, but this is what I believe. Yeah, you can take a blood test and you know whether you're XX or XY and you were born biologically male or biologically female, but I do believe that there is a spectrum of gender that people experience and feel different ways. Now, I know how I feel. I know who I'm attracted to and who I'm not attracted to, and I know that I feel female, and I that is these are my truths, and I believe that personally, the gender and sex are different things, so that contributes to how the truths could potentially be separate and distinct. Yeah, that's what I'd say
Very
about that.
interesting. Yes. Well, I think, this topic obviously is very wide
It's
and we can
big,
take it
yeah.
from so many different directions. It's not just philosophical, it's a very practical one because limits of tolerance is really something which is uh, very rooted in the life that we're living now.
Yes, and I would say that another reason why that issue in particular comes up as something that's tied in with phobia and hatred in general, is because it's tied not just to the differences. I think if we could just separate that people are wired differently in this way, that would be one thing. But instead, it is also connected to a sense of morality, that I am built in the correct way. I think the correct thing. I love the correct people, and others don't. And so this sort of otherness, I think, contributes to the fear, the phobia, the hatred when we don't understand and we don't agree with, and we think that someone has made this some sort of amoral decision that goes against other values or beliefs. And I think that's exactly where the line separates between an acknowledgement of our differences and going down this path, as we first talked about, of the hatred, the false narratives that get picked up as a result. Well, it's been quite the winding conversation, but I feel like we got to a good place. And thanks for chatting.
Thank you. Thank you.